Hi, I'm Ted Haftagaber, founder and producer of Live Talks Los Angeles. Thanks for joining us. Since we started over a decade ago, we have brought you hundreds of conversations with storytellers, writers, actors, musicians, humorists, chefs, and thought leaders in business and science. You can watch and hear most of these in our YouTube channel and our podcast. For details, visit livetalksla.org. And now, here's the show you've tuned in to see.
This is the most excited I have ever been to be in high school. I was just in San Francisco, which is where I grew up. I grew up in the East Bay, in a town called Castro Valley. And I was speaking in San Francisco last night, and I mentioned where I had grown up, and there's people clapped and cheered. There were people from my hometown, from Castro Valley, in the room, and I got in trouble because I said, let me ask you about something from my high school. It's the thing I most enjoyed about my high school experience, and I want to know if it's still true. And there's people from my high school in the audience, and I said, is the mascot still the Trojans? Yes, it's still the Trojans. Are the colors of the school still green and yellow? Yes. Does the swim team still wear yellow rubber caps that say Trojans on the side? And I had relatives there, and everybody was mortified because I am from a Catholic family, and I was not supposed to find that amusing, either in high school or at the age of 50, when I still find it hilarious for exactly the same reason, because I am immature. Anyway, so it's really nice to be here. I'm really excited to be talking with Jacob Soboroff tonight, who is a fantastic colleague at MSNBC, a brilliant reporter. And I don't want to intrude too much on that time, so I'm going to read a little bit from the book and just say a thing, and then we're going to get right to talking to Jacob and then to your questions. So here we go. He was one of the most successful and celebrated industrialists on the planet. His anti-Semitism was rank, and it was unchecked. He spewed it freely in private tirades among friends and family and close business cohorts and newspaper reporters, or pretty much anybody within earshot. In the office, in private chats, in interviews, at dinners, even on camping trips. One close friend wrote in his diary after witnessing one late night round the campfire diatribe, quote, "Ford attributes all evil to Jews." Henry Ford even ordered his engineers to forgo the use of any brass in his Model T automobile. He called brass a Jew metal. Ford said, quote, "Wherever there's anything wrong with the country, you'll find the Jews on the job there." He blamed a vast and inchoate Jewish conspiracy for inciting his workers to demand that he share a sliver more of the expansive Ford Motor Company profits with them. He blamed Jews for the gold standard and for the advent of the Federal Reserve Bank. He blamed Jews for ruining motion pictures in America. He blamed Jews for ruining popular music. He blamed Jews for ruining baseball. Now, he was hardly the only radical anti-Semite in the United States around 1920, but in addition to his fortune and his famous name and his iconic company, Henry Ford also had a megaphone that your average crazy uncle theorizer lacked. He had a newspaper. It was called the Dearborn Independent, and he had purchased it for a song in 1918. Now, the paper was a big money loser in the beginning, with poor to middling circulation. Ford's editorial harangues did little to draw new readers. How many attacks on the man who had beaten Ford in the most recent Michigan U.S. Senate race did the public really want? Oh, but Truman H. Newberry had stolen that election. Stolen. One of the Independent's editorial staffers, who was a veteran of the New York newspaper wars, had an idea. He wrote to Ford's right-hand man, quote, "Find an evil to attack. Let's find some sensationalism." And lo, the answer landed unbidden not long after. A newly translated English language edition that was titled The Protocols of the Meetings of the Learned Elders of Zion. This was a pamphlet that was the work of Russian fabulists who were furious at the Bolsheviks toppling the old Tsarist aristocracy in Russia. The Tsarists portrayed the Russian Revolution as not just a local affair, but as the early innings of a plot by a cabal of all-powerful Jewish schemers to take over the world. The Protocols was billed as the product of a surreptitious note-taker at a top-secret meeting wherein these Jewish puppet masters had drawn up their strategy and tactics in detail. Now, there was no secret meeting, obviously. There was no secret plot. There was no surreptitious note-taker. It was all a work of fiction, a very considered, very deliberate lie, and a very dangerous piece of propaganda. But Henry Ford bore down on it. He bore down on a new weekly series in the Dearborn Independent that was based on the Protocols. It was a weekly series that ended up being a 92-part weekly series. Every week for 92 weeks, headlines like these ran in Ford's paper: "The International Jew, the World's Problem," and "Jewish Jazz, Moron Music, becomes our national music," and "The Perils of Baseball, Too Much Jew." These headlines, all literally those headlines, were splashed onto the pages of Ford's newspaper, which was then distributed in Ford motor dealerships across the country. Ford also saw to the publication of this series in book form. It was 4 volumes, and it was called The International Jew. Now, never mind that the Protocols had been exposed as a hoax, as a total make-believe fake thing in 1921, which was right in the middle of Henry Ford's 92-week series. Nevertheless, Ford's weekly International Jew essays continued without pause, and Ford motor dealers kept tossing the latest issue of the Dearborn Independent onto the front seats of all the newly purchased Model T automobiles in the country. Ford saw to it that the 4 volumes of the book-length version of the International Jew, those were translated and published worldwide in 12 international editions, including one in Germany. And stick a pin in that. Of all the contributions that Henry Ford made to this world, one of them was this. He produced the most prolific, most sustained published attack on Jews the world had ever known. And other Americans fought back. Other Americans organized an anti-Semitic publicity campaign that included a lot of notable and notably Gentile Americans. Prominent public figures like Woodrow Wilson and Clarence Darrow and W.E.B. Du Bois and William Jennings Bryan all joined the fight. They all called Ford's utterings un-American and un-Christian. The former US President, William Howard Taft, was soon to be named Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He accepted a speaking engagement at an Anti-Defamation League meeting in Chicago 2 days before Christmas in 1920. And at that event, he lambasted Ford. He said, "There is not the slightest ground for anti-Semitism among us. It has no place in free America." Now, the German edition of Ford's book landed in the hands of one particularly gifted propagandist. When Adolf Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, was published in 1925, the author appeared to lift not just ideas, but whole passages, plagiarism style, from Ford's own publications. The first edition of Mein Kampf actually extolled Henry Ford by name. Hitler wrote, "It is Jews who govern the stock exchange forces of the American Union. Every year makes them more and more the controlling masters of the controlling masters of the producers in a nation of 120 million. Only a single great man, Ford, to their fury, still maintains full independence." By this time, Hitler had already mulled sending German shock troops to major American cities to aid Ford in what Hitler hoped would be his run for president in 1924. When a reporter from the Detroit News showed up at Nazi Party headquarters in Munich in December 1931 to interview Hitler for her ongoing series. She had her own ongoing series. It was called 5 Minutes with Men in Public Eye. This Detroit newspaper woman showed up to interview Hitler, and she was surprised to find hanging on the wall behind Hitler's desk a large framed portrait of a very famous American. Hitler explained to the Detroit newspaper woman, quote, "I regard Henry Ford as my inspiration." The reporter asked Adolf Hitler that day point blank why he was anti-Semitic. And he said without hesitation, "Somebody has to be blamed for our troubles." So, in the 1930s, in the United States, the international winds that put Germany in Hitler's hands and Italy in Mussolini's and Spain in Franco's hands, the same international winds that saw a fascist mob storm the French parliament in 1934 and physically overthrow the elected government of France, that saw the British Union of Fascists founded in 1932. Those winds were blowing through our borders too. We too had rabid anti-Semitism and pro-fascist agitation advanced by really influential people. The most famous industrialist in the country was Henry Ford. The most influential right-wing media figure the country has ever had by a mile, Father Charles Coughlin. The consensus national hero of the day, a man whose name was familiar, second only to the president's own name in terms of its familiarity in American households. The hero aviator Charles Lindbergh. The largest voluntary political organization in the country was the America First Committee, which advocated against us joining the fight against Hitler, including, once Charles Lindbergh became its spokesperson in 1941, they followed his arguments. Lindbergh, by that point, was arguing that the reason we should stay out of World War II, or maybe ally ourselves with Germany, if anyone, was because aviation was a gift from God to white people only. And the United States should recognize Germany's technical genius, recognize in them a country with whom we could join to save the white race against the barbarian hordes. These were the most influential people in the whole country. And their work was accelerated by an aggressive effort by the German government to propagandize the American public. Propaganda telling us not to believe what they derided as atrocity stories about the Nazis. Propaganda telling us to see democracy as weak and corrupt and a failed project whose time had passed. We also had proliferating paramilitary groups who literally built and stockpiled bombs, who stole US military weapons, who plotted to overthrow the US government, and in some cases they had advice and support from the German government in Berlin to try to do it. So, Prequel is about those dynamics being at work and sort of taking hold here in America to a surprising degree in the run-up to World War II. I will also say, the reason the book is called Prequel is not because I believe we are dealing with some new iteration of Nazis or Hitler today, or even that there is any analogy between anything in modern history and Germany under the Nazi Party and Hitler from 1933 to 1945. Only Hitler is Hitler, only Nazis are Nazis. The reason this book is called Prequel is not because of the bad guys, but because of the good guys. Because from that era, we very, I think, comfortably and rightfully, proudly remember Americans who put on uniforms and went over there and fought Nazis. But there were also Americans who fought Nazi operations here in the United States. There were Americans who fought their fellow Americans, who sided with the Nazis and worked for the Nazi cause and tried to implement an American form of Nazism in this country. That happened here, too, and I feel like, well, first of all, that's who this book is about. That's what the prequel is. because I feel like those Americans who fought all of that, they gave us a gift. They at least left us stories and lessons for how to think about our challenges today. What are your options when an American ultra-right rises and starts agitating to end our system of government to replace it with a strongman form of government instead? What are your options in particular when a movement like that isn't just agitating on the fringe? I mean, when I grew up in Castro Valley, California, in addition to having puerile humor about my campus swim team, we were also very aware of racist skinhead groups who were recruiting in the parking lot of my high school at lunchtime. My first ever activism was trying to get anti-racist skinheads to go beat up the racist skinheads. I, of course, wasn't going to get involved myself. I was just coordinating. Real portrait and bravery here. You guys do it. I'll be over here. But I grew up thinking of these forces as alive, but really far out there on the fringe. And I feel like I have learned from studying this time in history how to think about what our options are in particular when we've got an ultra-right, anti-democratic, violent movement in this country that isn't just advocating on the fringe, that has unnerving connections to elected politicians and to people with real political power. So that's basically it. I mean, I feel like here in this room today in Los Angeles, we are alive and sentient at a time when there is an ascendant ultra-right in America that is linked to some of the most powerful people and forces in politics. And it includes right-wing armed paramilitary groups, some of whom have been recently put on trial for sedition, for trying to overthrow the US government by force. It involves the denial of election results, mass disinformation and conspiracy theories, and intimidation targeting minorities and targeting Jewish Americans. It weirdly involves big, hot, sexy crushes on foreign authoritarian leaders. And the use of force and violence to try to constrain and indeed affect our political outcomes. So that turns out to be our time. That's what we will get to say happened in our lifetime in America. It has also been some other times in America too. And knowing that it has come for us now makes me want to know how Americans like us coped with it when it came for them. It also makes me realize, humbly, that for our descendants and for the next generation of Americans, for anybody who writes, future books or does whatever the future version of podcast is, what we do now is what they will learn from us. There are things that heroic Americans did inside and outside the government in the 1930s and the early 1940s that I believe are almost an instruction manual for us in terms of how to stand up to this kind of thing. What we do now will be studied 80 years from now, or whenever it is this comes around again, when people are looking for more good ideas as to how to stop this sort of thing and save American democracy once again. So what do you want to be able to brag about? What do you want to be able to tell people that you did in your country, in your lifetime, when you were here and alive when all this happened? It is not it's not a fortuitous thing. It's not a lucky thing to live in an important time. But this is an important time. So thank you for being here tonight.